Jim DiEugenio is a veteran author and researcher, lately focusing on JFK's foreign policy. He's the author of Destiny Betrayed and Reclaiming Parkland. We're going to talk a little bit about this William Turner KPFA 1967 interview. Jim, you had a chance to look it over. You want to tell us a little bit about William Turner?
Yeah, sure. Bill Turner was a longtime FBI agent. I think he worked in the FBI for something like 10 years. He then decided, well, there's a debate as to whether he stepped down or he was forced out. But he had some problems with some of the things that Hoover was doing, all right? And he took them public. And either way, he was retired from the FBI after about 10 years. I believe it was in the late 50s, very early 60s, that he stepped out from the FBI. He then began his journalistic career. He wrote both magazine articles and books. And almost all of his books, even today, are still pretty valuable. The book he did, for example, on the Robert Kennedy assassination, co-authored with John Christian, is still one of the best books on the RFK assassination. The book he co-authored with Warren Hinkle, The Fish is Red, is another very good book on the JFK case. One of the main places where he wrote for was Ramparts magazine, the legendary Ramparts magazine, which under Warren Hinkle, the editorship of Warren Hinkle, was, in my opinion, and the opinion of very many other people, was the finest magazine ever published in the United States after World War II. There really hasn't been anything else that's even come close to the achievement of Ramparts under Warren Hinkle. And Bill did some very good articles. One of the articles he did was about the Minutemen organization. He had this extraordinary source for that magazine article who had essentially defected from the Minutemen and given Bill a wealth of information about some very strange activities they were participating in, especially in the South. And so when Garrison started his investigation in the JFK case, this was one of the angles he was exploring, the militant right-wing angle. And so he got into contact with Bill after his article appeared in Ramparts, and he asked him to come down and have a brainstorm session with him. And so he did. And this is how Bill eventually became one of the deputies on Garrison's case. And as you'll see in this interview, at this time, late 1967, he'd already spent about 2 weeks actually in the office. Most of the time, Bill stayed at his home in California, and Garrison then gave him assignments to do, all right, on the West Coast. Now, Bill ended up staying around all the way. In fact, I've seen memos by Bill as late as 1969 on the eve of the Clay Shot trial. And he actually wrote a manuscript about Garrison, which he actually had a prospective buyer for. In fact, in this interview, you'll see the moderator mentions it, okay, called the Garrison case. But what happened is, after the Clay Shot trial failed, they mutually agreed to go ahead and withdraw the book. Now, Bill, if you ask me, Bill Turner's articles in Ramparts on Garrison were, in my opinion, the best articles written about Jim Garrison in the mainstream press. And remember, Ramparts had about 250,000 circulation at that time, which was quite a lot. And so a lot of people, in fact, they even put Garrison on the cover, right? Warren Hinkle had to fight off certain people in the Ramparts office who didn't want to go down this angle of the Kennedy assassination. But Hinkle thought that it was worthwhile because he had read the Warren Commission volumes. And he said he stopped reading it at about volume 14 because by then he had decided the thing was a joke. And the last thing that people in the Warren Commission wanted to find out was who killed Kennedy, all right? And so that's why he decided to go ahead and write about Garrison. And Bill wrote, if I remember correctly, 3 or 4 articles in Ramparts about Jim Garrison. And they were all quite valuable. And the moderator mentions one here, The Inquest, which I think was his first article, which is really quite good, even well worth reading today. And so Bill was, I guess you could say, back then, the only journalist in America who was actually writing, giving Garrison a fair shake in the press. And like I said, Ramparts had a very good circulation of about 250,000 at its pinnacle. Now, Hal Verb was a researcher, the other person being interviewed, in the San Francisco area, who had served, I believe, in the armed services and knew a lot about military intelligence. And Hal ended up being a pretty good researcher. He passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, and he ended up writing for some Kennedy assassination journals like the Third Decade and the Fourth Decade. Very reputable guy. All right. And they bring up some certain points in this interview, which I wasn't even aware of myself. I am one of the very few people, there's only about 4 of us in the whole country, who had access to what was left of Garrison's files because Jim Garrison's children let me and a couple other people copy them while we were in New Orleans. This was in the mid-'90s. But Bill talks about some things in here which are not in those files, which I think you can deduce rather logically, and I've maintained this for years and years and years, that what we have of Garrison's files today is, I would say, at the most, 60% of what Jim Garrison actually had in his archive. The rest of it was stolen by CIA agents who were planted in his office. A lot of it was destroyed by Harry Connick, who succeeded him as DA, and incinerated a lot of the stuff. And then there were several file cabinets that Garrison gave to a friend of his to store for him in his garage, and those ended up being stolen. And so it's a real shame that we simply don't have anywhere near what really Garrison had discovered in New Orleans during his 2-year-long investigation. But Bill brings up a couple of things that Garrison had, like, for instance, in talking about Jack Ruby, he talks about how the police turned over a source for them that needed a job, and Ruby went ahead, gave him a certain amount of money, and told him to go to Alexandria, Louisiana, check into the hotel, and somebody will contact you further. And so if you go ahead and follow the conversation, the guy who contacted him was Oswald. All right? Okay, that's in about halfway through the conversation. And then he also talks about a guy named Don Norton. Now, Don Norton has a little bit more exposure. That part of the story has a little bit more exposure. I actually saw a file on that. But he was a courier for the CIA. And he said, one part of the story was that, that he had been a courier for the CIA, and that he recalled Oswald as being one of the people involved in the CIA at that time. And he also recalled David Ferry as being one of the people that he would go ahead and bring money to from the CIA. So this, so there's some things in here, this Turner interview and Hal Verb, that are pretty rare, and it's much worth reading for those purposes.
I am in the studio with William Turner, staff writer of Ramparts magazine and author of a forthcoming book, Police USA, which will be published by Putnam. Invisible Witness, Bob's Merrill, the Garrison Case Award books. Mr. Turner is a former FBI agent. He wrote the inquest in June Ramparts outlining Garrison's case, and the Press versus Garrison in the September Ramparts. This is not Mr. Turner's first appearance in our studio. quite a number of years ago now, several years ago, Mr. Turner appeared over this station when he was originally in the process of leaving the FBI and made us no more popular with the authorities. So he's been a lot of places and done a lot of things since then. The second person we have with us is Mr. Hal Verb, who has been is a reporter for the Berkeley Barb and has also been doing some work at San Francisco State, conducting a seminar, I believe, on the assassination of President Kennedy and the Warren Commission report. Now, what we've asked these two to come and chat with us about is what's going on in New Orleans and what role Jim Garrison has played in this, where it is now, and what, how they estimate its significance, its relevance. Is it more than simply a theory that Mr. Garrison is working with? Perhaps you could bring us up to date on some of the facts, Mr. Turner.
I'd be glad to talk about Jim Garrison's case. Actually, Garrison first got into the assassination investigation the day after the assassination. On that Saturday, he called what he called a brainstorming session of his staff, and they went over any possible New Orleans angles or persons who were erratic enough to have been involved in a conspiracy. And at that time, they came up with the name of David William Ferry, who you will recall died this year on February 22nd after he became involved in Garrison's current investigation. Now, at that time, Ferry had made a rather mysterious trip to the state of Texas, leaving the afternoon of the assassination. And in that trip, he went first to Houston by car, where he appeared at an ice skating rink, and according to the owner now, he stood by the telephone for several hours on that Saturday afternoon. He apparently received a call and then went to Galveston. Now, Garrison was waiting for him when he got back on Sunday to New Orleans and picked him up and turned him over to the FBI for interrogation because of the very suspicious nature of this trip. In other words, Garrison thought it was a very curious trip by a curious man at a curious time. The FBI released him, and apparently the reason was that, number one, Ferry had not left on that trip until well after the assassination, say 5 or 6 hours, and also because they determined that his small airplane was not airworthy at the time, and therefore he couldn't have been in on an escape plan. Now, there the man arrested, and as Garrison puts it, he said, "I had confidence in the competency of the FBI." He himself is a former agent of the FBI, who was in approximately a year, and interestingly enough, he was in the same office that I was in Seattle. So it was not until last fall, when he was riding a plane to New York with Senator Russell Long of Louisiana, that his interest was renewed. Apparently they were discussing the various books that had come out, and Senator Long made the statement that he really believed that there was more to it than Oswald. And they conversed on it. When Garrison got back to New Orleans, he went into virtual seclusion, poring over the Warren Report and its volumes, and he quietly launched his inquiry. And on the basis of the initial returns in this inquiry, he became convinced that indeed there was an assassination plot, and that the assassination plot had at least one aspect in New Orleans. So that is how he got started on it, and as you know, it's still going on.
Well, in what form is it still going on? Would one of you, how is he proceeding at this point, and where does he intend to, is it just simply become a private investigation now? There's nobody up for trial at the moment, is there?
Well, yes, there is. Clay Shaw is scheduled for trial, but let me put it this way, that Shaw was arrested, I believe it was the latter part of February. and through all kinds of legal maneuvering. Maneuvering is the word of the judge down there, not mine. It's been postponed and held off, and a trial date has not yet been set. However, Garrison stresses that he does not believe that Shaw is at the center of any web of conspiracy, that he is a peripheral participant in this. And therefore, he has made a motion in open court to speed up the trial of Shaw so that he can sort of clear the decks with his own investigation. As it is, he is held up with all these legal motions in the Shaw case. He does not have a greatly enlarged staff, and they have their normal caseload, criminal caseload, to handle. And he also has been subjected to attacks from Life magazine, which insinuates that he is somehow sympathetic to organized crime, which is laughable, because probably of all the district attorneys in the nation, he has done more to clean up organized crime than anyone. By NBC, CBS, the bulk of the national media, the mass media, and therefore he would like to be able to devote more time to the investigation. But he does have an investigation. He's got main files that are set up somewhat like the FBI's. He has an archivist to handle the Garrison archives. He has men who are specializing in the Kennedy assassination investigation, and I've spent a total of 2 weeks inside his office down there, and every day there's a new angle.
Well, tell me, inasmuch as there must be quite a few people who wish he would dry up and blow away, can he, as prosecuting attorney, just sit there and utilize that much taxpayers' money to follow up on something simply because he believes in it? Is there any chance of or possibility of actual either legal or political pressure to make him stop this?
There have been all kinds of pressures brought to bear. Now, Garrison was carrying on his inquiry in secret. This is the best way, of course, to carry on an inquiry, at least at its initial stages. Now, the state's item newspaper, New Orleans, checked the disbursements of his office and found that there were exorbitant, what they considered exorbitant travel expenses. People were going to Miami, they were going to Chicago, San Francisco. And this is the way they got wind of what he was doing, and they broke it in the paper. Well, Garrison, at that time, number one, there was a loud hue and cry that he was expending public funds on a wild goose chase. Now, he didn't want to come out and release all his evidence to substantiate that it was not a wild goose chase. Therefore, they formed a group, businessmen in New Orleans formed a group called Truth or Consequences Incorporated, which is privately financing the assassination investigation. They signed up to contribute so much a month, and this is what is really subsidizing his assassination investigation.
But through the prosecuting attorney's office, or separate from the prosecuting attorney's office?
Well, through the office. Through the office. Now, you mentioned pressures brought to bear. You get in his office down there, and you almost feel like you're in maybe a Russian embassy on U.S. soil, the way he's been treated. For one thing, there is an organization down there called the Metropolitan Crime Commission. An ex-FBI agent by the name of Aaron Cohen is the head of this. Now, of course, this is, again, a privately subsidized operation, and Mr. Cohen has to have organized crime around in order for himself to exist. And it seems that since Garrison's investigation has come up, Cohen has been inordinately active in trying to say that there's organized crime in the parish of Orleans. He's been called before the grand jury down there several times to try and specify what he means by this, and he's been unable to do so. Nevertheless, there is one pressure point. As I mentioned, the national press is another pressure point. Bobby Kennedy's emissary, Walter Sheridan, was down there from the inception of Garrison's investigation, and he has attempted, there is a legal allegation that he has attempted public bribery in getting to Garrison's witnesses. It is alleged that Perry Russo, who was a key witness in the Shaw case, was offered a sum of money by Sheridan. Sheridan allegedly told him that we'll get you to California and they won't be able to extradite you from there, and various other types of either intimidation or lures. They've been using the carrot and the stick down there.
Yes, Hal.
Yes, one of the things that Bill has mentioned are these different pressure points, and he's pointed out the press nationally and locally has not given the Garrison case a fair shake. We can speak about the local press here. I think the only fair shake that they've given Garrison is that there is no news that is covered in local press here that gives anything that he says to counter charges that are made against him. I'll specifically mention one. For example, when Life magazine said that Garrison had been connected with the mafia, and this was reported in the press, Garrison had made an instant reply to that, and he said, "I don't even know Carlos Marcello," and that was the specific individual who Life magazine had tied him in with. "I wouldn't even know him if he were sitting right here next to me." Now, this thing has never even appeared locally. I doubt if there are few people here in the Bay Area who even, or in the whole state for that matter, who even know about this remark. And this is typical. NBC, CBS will present their program giving their version of what they say are both sides of the story, when in fact it is only one side.
Yes, I believe you had something about some TV coverage that you wanted to talk about. Would this be the time that you would like to go into that a little more fully?
Yes. There seems to have been what I would regard as a massive attempt to, if not obstruct the investigation, to at least put obstacles in the way of it that would prevent Garrison's case from really coming to court, or at least having his say with respect to what he has presented. Now, for example, CBS presented a 4-part series late in the summer, I think it was the end of June, in which they made references to specifically to Garrison's case. And one of the things that they mentioned was the kind of attempts that were made by Garrison's office, this is allegedly what they said, to bribe and intimidate witnesses. And for example, they pointed to a writer this is a quote from one of the transcripts that I have of the 4-part series. They said there was a writer for the Saturday Evening Post who said he had read transcripts of what went on at those sessions. Now, the fact is that there were never any such transcripts, and this writer had actually seen Scamber's notes. And what this writer was trying to show was that this particular person had written a document or statements in which he had said that a key witness in this probe, Raymond Russo, had lied about what he had presented as evidence. The fact is that this was never the case, because there were in fact memorandums that were prepared, and that this writer actually was aware of the existence of these memorandums. Now, this did not get into the TV coverage.
Well, where would you like to go from here on this? What is Garrison's theory? I mean, what you say that the man Shaw, Ferry, is dead. There seem to be an awful lot of dead people.
Right.
Connected with the whole
tabulation goes on. And
yes. So Ferry's dead, whatever it was he was supposed to be doing. Now, what about Shaw, and what is Garrison's overall...
Well, all right. In broad terms, it is this. And I think that this will also explain the orchestrated attack on him. Garrison believes that Oswald, number one, was a CIA agent, and that he probably had been trained at the Atsugi base in Japan when he was in the Marine Corps. This would have been back around 1957, 58. Atsugi reportedly is a U-2 installation. And in the restricted documents, the still classified documents in the archives, is a very tantalizing one entitled Oswald's Access to U-2 Information. Now, necessarily, this means that when Oswald went to the Soviet Union, he was a CIA operative. And, of course, there's liberal evidence to back this up, most of it suggestive rather than direct. But for one thing, when he came back, he told a fellow employee in Dallas, where he's working in a photographic lab, about the disbursement of Soviet military forces, how they did not intermingle their armored divisions with infantry, and then he said, I didn't notice any vapor trails over Minsk. Minsk is where he was when he was in the Soviet Union for most of his stay. Now, Garrison believes that Oswald's leftist activity in New Orleans and Dallas, his attempts to insinuate himself into the confidence of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Communist Party USA, was nothing more than an attempt to erect a facade. Such a facade would have given him perhaps easier access to communist countries. It would have given him, once in, a freer movement. Now, when Oswald went to the Soviet embassy, or pardon me, the Cuban embassy, in Mexico City, he very carefully listed all these affiliations with these groups, which of course existed only in his own mind. He never was formally accepted into any of them. Now, who was Oswald then? If he was not really a leftist, who was he? Well, Garrison's evidence will show that Oswald was affiliated with a group in New Orleans which was anti-Castro in nature and was paramilitary in nature. It was composed of, down in that area, there is a tremendous cross-pollination of people who are members of the Minutemen, who are Cuban exiles violently opposed to Castro, who are even members of the KKK. And it was with one of these factions with whom Oswald was traveling. Now, with that in mind, how does the CIA come into it? Because Garrison believes that the CIA is the one, or the reason that there is this orchestrated attack on him. Well, very simply, it was the CIA which sponsored these anti-Castro groups, which were supposed to, even after the Bay of Pigs failure, never relinquish their dreams of reinvading Cuba. And as a matter of fact, these groups were very active in training in the environs of New Orleans. Garrison found one of their bases where one of the founders of the Minutemen had been arrested by the FBI and secretly let go. His name never appeared in the newspapers. These people became very disenchanted with President Kennedy after what they called all his promises about freeing Cuba and not coming through, and then his apparent rapprochement with Cuba, which was in the works at the time of the assassination, was being handled through the Cuban ambassador La Chumba in the United Nations, and through an intermediary, a ABC newswoman who was on very close personal terms, Lisa Howard, very close personal terms with Castro. So what Garrison believes is these anti-Castro groups, which had been nurtured by the CIA, one of the factions, a spin-off from this group, got out of hand, set up Oswald as the patsy, and assassinated Kennedy in Dealey Plaza.
In other words, he doesn't think that the CIA ordered Kennedy's assassination, but simply that a group that had been involved and financed by the CIA went its own way.
Right. The CIA, by its very nature, is compartmentized or cellular, like they used to talk about Communist Party cells and how one didn't know the other. And this is exactly the structure of the CIA. And it's very easy for one of these cells, CIA cells, to becoming so involved in deceit, duplicity, assassination, murder, to go off and do something like this. And the operation at Dealey Plaza had all the earmarks of a paramilitary type of ambush. There's no question about it.
And Ferry and Shaw were involved in that group. Is that
Now, the
connection?
legal allegations against Shaw are that he conspired. It's a conspiracy charge in New Orleans with David Ferry and Oswald to assassinate the president. Garrison's legal bill of particulars states that a session in which they discussed and planned an assassination talk or particulars culminated in what happened at Dealey Plaza. And as I said before, however, Garrison has gone no farther in his charges on Shaw. However, he has independent evidence to back up Shaw's identity as Clay Bertram. As you may know, that is a big bone of contention. Shaw says he is not Clay Bertram. Garrison says he is. Now, Clay Bertram comes into it this way. Immediately after the assassination, a New Orleans attorney, Dean Andrews, who had handled what he calls the gay swishers in New Orleans, and also Oswald. Oswald apparently wanted his discharge changed, said that immediately after the assassination he received a phone call from this man whom he knew as Clay Bertram. And Clay Bertram was a man who had referred Oswald to his office. And he said that Bertram asked him if he would defend Oswald against the assassination charges. Of course, before anything further could be done, Oswald himself was killed. Now, as I say, it is part of Garrison's allegations that Clay Shaw is in fact the man using the name Clay Bertram, and this he intends to prove in court. Also, the facts of the conspiracy. Now, one of the allegations to prove this is that Clay Shaw met in Baton Rouge with Jack Ruby and with Oswald. And he has witness that will testify to this. So this is the case against Shaw, which, as I say, is up for. It has not yet been set on the calendar, but will come off late this year or early next.
Does he have any witnesses who claim to have been a member of this group themselves? Or is this all inferential evidence?
Well,
do you know whether or not anyone within the little right-wing CIA, whatever you want to call it, type group that this plot took place in, according to him?
Yeah.
Is there anyone who was a part of that he has been able to get as a witness?
Unfortunately, no, because obviously. These people would be accessories before the fact, at the very least, if not participants, accessories after the fact, and certainly, you talked about the mysterious deaths. These people would not be very prone to talk, knowing what the penalty might be.
Well, but he must have found it out some way. I wondered if by any chance it was a question of someone from the group informing, even if for reasons it would be very obvious that person were being protected.
Let me put it this way, then, that there have been people who have been within the group or on the periphery of it, who have been able to give him at least part of a story. No one has come...
Well, that's what I was driving
yes,
at.
right.
I wasn't expecting that anyone who had helped to plan the assassination of the president
yes.
would come along and say, I was a member of a conspiracy.
Like former Minutemen, for
Yes,
example.
but
Yes, there have been a couple of those.
Because, for example, as far as I know, it's never been absolutely proven that such a group existed and that Oswald was a member of it. Well, anybody who had ever been in that group would be a valuable witness to that.
This is true,
much.
right.
You see,
I
was wondering what the depth was on the witness situation.
Yeah, there has been no one, unfortunately, who has been able to tell them that, yes, I was in this group, yes, I was part of the assassination team at Dealey Plaza, yes, so-and-so and so-and-so shot from behind the grassy
No, I
knoll fence.
understand that,
yeah.
Bill, but the point
Yeah.
is that sometimes you have a group that might be composed of, say, 10 or 15 people, and that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be a minority, even within so small a group, that was doing something. But at least that any one of those 15 people could testify, the people who belonged to this group and who normally came to our meetings were so-and-so, so-and-so, and if Oswald and Ferry and Shaw were three of them, then that much would be established. It was that kind of evidence I was thinking.
Elsa, there have been a couple of cracks in this little structure. There have been.
Well, that looks as if he's gotten that far anyway.
Yes, he has.
And would this, does he think this is involved, well, you mentioned the fact that there was Cuban participation in these groups.
Cuban exile.
Yes.
Yes, right.
May I make a point about
Yes.
this? Very early in when the whole case about Garrison's investigation broke, there were charges that pro-Castro Cubans had somehow been involved, and some of the press had picked up the story that at first
Now, this
Garrison...
is pro-Castro Cubans.
This is pro-Castro
Yes,
Cubans.
this is the was he right, was he left.
Right. That pro-Castro elements were involved in the assassination, and the press allegedly stated that allegedly Garrison had actually conceived of this as possibly one of the elements in the conspiracy. I'm talking about certain sections of the press. The fact is that at no time was this a possibility when Garrison launched his investigation. In fact, through all the investigations that he has conducted, there's one thing that does stand out, and that is that Oswald, who does play, of course, an important role in this whole case, all his associations during his entire trip, both through New Orleans and Dallas, were with elements that can be considered paramilitary right-wing groups, and that all his associations were primarily of a right-wing extremist nature. There is no evidence to show that he was, as the press had identified him, as a leftist. This was merely
I guess
a cover.
it did come out that he had made approaches to certain left-wing groups, but I remember that within days, or at least very shortly after the assassination, that there wasn't also a news item about the fact that at one time he had volunteered to train people to go in on the Bay of Pigs invasion. In other words, a completely contrary story. Now, that hit the press sometime very quickly after the assassination and then died. I never saw anything more about that, but I clearly remember this because it made a great deal more sense in the context of what one knew about Oswald, than the other story. And so I do remember it.
Yes, I think what you're referring to is an incident when Oswald had approached a anti-Castro refugee by the name of Carlos Bringuer in New Orleans. And apparently it's my belief, that when Oswald had done this, he had blown his cover, so to speak, about his connections with the CIA at this particular point, because Bringuer had become immediately suspicious of Oswald, that he was a double agent. Now, while he was in New Orleans, Oswald managed to get himself a lot of publicity, and I don't think this was quite undeliberate. I think this was on the part of an expected cover that he was expected to assume. He got on a program on radio, WDSU, in which he debated a person who was connected with a group called INCA, which was the Information Council of America. Now, this group was connected with right-wing anti-Castro refugees and had extensive operations in connection with Latin American revolutions. Now, the thing about this INCA group is that a number of individuals who are connected with this particular group, one of them, for example, is a man by the name of Mario Bermudez, who is the man who helped arrange the trip for Clay Shaw when he was here in San Francisco. Now, if you'll recall, one of the things that Perry Raymond Russo had said in his testimony before the grand jury was that part of the plot that was to be executed on the day of November 22nd when President Kennedy was killed, part of this plot would have to have the principals of the case in other cities at the time so that no suspicion would be drawn upon them. And it's just curious to see that this man, Bermudez, is arranging a trip for Clay Shaw, the man who has now been charged with conspiring to kill the president. And here is this group, Inca, which manages to arrange this particular debate with Oswald while he's in New Orleans.
With Oswald taking a view contrary at that point to the right-wing view. Is that
Well, on this program, he took a view that he was a leftist who identified with the Castro
that's what
Revolution.
I mean. Yes, quite. But there was, I do distinctly remember seeing the item that he had, in spite of the fact that he was supposed to be on this, Friends of Cuba, the what was the name of the committee?
Fair Play for Cuba.
Fair Play for Cuba, and so on. That he also had been had volunteered at one time to train people to go in on the Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuban exiles.
This
which
is
would
probably
be,
the Carlos Brunier episode, because he appeared voluntarily at Brunier's office. Brunier was probably one of the best known of the anti-Castro exiles down there. And he, as a sign of good faith, he presented Brunier with his Marine Corps drill manual or field manual. And Brunier felt that he couldn't be trusted, and maybe he was a plant and had nothing more to do with them, although that little altercation where Brunier, when Oswald was out in front of the International Trade Mart with his Fair Play for Cuba handbills, and Brunier comes up in this little altercation, and Oswald said, well, go ahead, hit me if you want, Carlos. It almost sounds like it was staged. That Oswald really was trying to say, well, look, I'm on your side. And all the evidence points that way.
Well, everything that one has ever read would give one the impression, certainly, that Oswald, whether by design and whether on behalf of just himself or other people, was certainly playing both sides of the street.
Oh, yeah.
So you therefore have your choice as to
Right.
which side of the street he was really in the pay of.
Well, when why would Oswald be associating with a guy like Jack Ruby? And Garrison has abundant evidence to show that he was. Why would he be associating with a man like that who really is apolitical, on the surface at least? This isn't somebody that Oswald would just pick up and associate with because he really didn't like nightlife that much to go to the Carousel Club.
Well, what role does Garrison figure Ruby did play in it?
Garrison feels that Ruby was manipulated in this thing, probably by the Dallas police. Now, Dallas police is too general. Probably by key people within the Dallas police. And for example, Hal mentioned Jim Phelan's article in the Saturday Evening Post, which made Garrison look a little ridiculous. And one of the means of ridicule that Phelan used in this was to quote Garrison as that you have to look at this in the looking glass, almost like a Lewis Carroll, and this was a source of great hilarity. But it's really true. You do have to look at certain aspects of it in the looking glass. You have to look at Oswald in the looking glass. You have to look at Ruby. His facade was that he would go around in the time between the assassination and his own killing of Oswald, and he'd go down to the postal box, where Weissman's answers to his advertisement, the black-bordered ad wanted for treason, President Kennedy, was coming in and say, oh, isn't that awful, and draw attention to himself there. He would go out in the middle of the night and call up one of his employees, Larry Crayford, at the club, and go out and photograph the billboard that says impeach Earl Warren. Isn't that awful? And these tender remarks about Jacqueline Kennedy and sparing her the ordeal. Well, in other words, this was an attempt to draw attention to the fact that he was really very pro-Kennedy and very incensed that anybody would kill Kennedy, and therefore it creates a certain illusion, and that's what Garrison means by the looking glass.
Yes, I can see that, but where does he think Ruby really was? Does he think that Ruby was a part of this conspiracy? And
oh, certainly.
And it's obvious that that if there were a conspiracy, that Mr. Oswald was very definitely the patsy.
Yeah. Well, for example,
whatever he expected to be, that's what he was.
Yeah, I'll illustrate by one of the statement of one witness, sworn statement in Garrison's files. I shan't name the man, but it really doesn't make any difference. He's evaluated as probably a reliable witness. This man was an artist, sort of a transient artist. He'd go from town to town. He got a little bit on the shorts in Dallas, and he went into the Dallas. He went up to the H.L. Hunt's son's business office and asked, if he could give him a little dough or something. And H.L. Hunt's son said, well, I don't give out any. You go down to the Dallas Police Department, give them your Social Security number, and they'll take care of you. This man said he went down there. He gave his Social Security number. The officer fixed him up with some kind of a chit that would get him a full tank of gas, and he was given a little pocket money. And he said at that point, Jack Ruby came up and said, well, maybe I can get you at least a temporary job. And he said that Ruby gave him a certain amount of money, a nominal sum, and said, now you go down to Alexandria, Louisiana, and check in the Bentley Hotel there, and somebody will contact you further. Now this man and his wife corroborates this. They went, and the hotel records corroborate it. They went to the Bentley Hotel. At least they corroborate that they checked in there. Fine. His story is that he was no sooner in there than he was contacted by a man. His phone rang, come down the lobby, and it was Oswald. And Oswald conferred with him and made what at the time he considered a very cryptic statement to the effect that very soon some Catholic leaders will be killed, which
well, what did Oswald say he was supposed to do or anything? What did they confer
He said he'd
about?
be contacted further. He would just corroborate or confirming that he'd arrived, and then there was no further contact. And after a few days, this guy left. Now, the whole annals of this thing is filled with these kind of fits and starts. They seemed, but there was another incident. A man by the name of Donald Norton, who claims that he is a former CIA unpeople. Who worked for CIA on certain assignments, said, number one, that at one time he was sent to Atlanta and that he met a man at the Atlanta airport who gave him, he was a courier. Norton was a courier. He was to deliver this amount of money to Havana, and this was in '58 before Castro got to power. And that the man who gave him the money was an Eastern Airlines pilot named Hugh Ferris. Well, he later identifies Hugh Ferris as being Dave Ferry, and Ferry was indeed an Eastern Airlines pilot. He also said he was on another courier assignment to Monterrey, Mexico, and that in the course of this assignment, he delivered money to Oswald, a man he now identifies as Lee Oswald. This was in September of '62. And then took documents from Oswald, he doesn't know what they were, and delivered them to Calgary, Alberta, Canada, where a man gave him the password. It's a fine day in Tulsa, and he was an oil firm employee, and he delivered the documents to him. He got paid by the assignment. He said he got $5,000 for that assignment. Now, again, this man has been subjected.
You think it all happens on TV, but I guess it
doesn't. I can guarantee
it's just beyond
that this thing is almost surrealistic at times. I feel it's too James Bondish to be true, but the facts are there, and it really is the way it's turning out.
And he feels then that all of this, or at least a good deal of it, can be brought to light during the trial of this guy Shaw, if he can get
he doesn't. Garrison has made a statement. He said, I just hope the American people don't think that the Shaw trial is going to bring out everything, because he said, naturally, we can only introduce what is material and relevant. And as he said, Shaw is not at the center of this at all. Shaw is off to the side somewhere. Ergo, he won't be able to tell the whole story at this trial. And I know that he has a couple of other arrests in mind, but this, of course, as I say, he is so freighted now with the Shaw trial and with this attack against him that he just has to clear the decks.
And he wants to get the Shaw trial over with before he starts on what he considers to be the next step.
He's made a motion in open court. And again, the attempt to abort the Shaw trial is very evident. And again, Shaw himself seems to have CIA connections. Now, the foreign press has reported this. I have not read word one about it in the domestic press. But in 1958, Shaw was on the board of directors of a Rome corporation called the World Trade Center. Now, Shaw, through his attorney, admits he was on this board of directors. He said, however, he was merely asked to be on it by his own board of directors at the International Trade Mart. Now, on his board of directors are some very strange people. One of them is the secretary of the Italian neo-fascist party. Another is the son-in-law of Nazi finance minister Helmer Schacht. Another is a fellow who is now an executive of the Bank of Montreal, and he's a former OSS major by the name of L.M. Bloomfield. This group was kicked out of Italy, the World Trade Center, because although it seemed to have plenty of money, it never did any ostensible business, and they suspected the Italian police that it was a CIA front. It is now headquartered in Johannesburg, South Africa, under the same name, which is probably a more friendly climate. It also had a subsidiary corporation in Switzerland, which likewise was ousted by the Swiss police because it was suspected of being a conduit for funds for the OAS movement, the Algérie Française movement in Algeria. So I must say that if Mr. Shaw can explain this in terms of his just innocently being asked to go on the board, I will have to say then that the entire board of directors of the International Trade Mart in New Orleans are either extremely naive or involved with the CIA.
Yes, Hal.
May I just make this point? Bill has brought up an interesting point, and that is the deeper you get involved in this, the more the connections you see, not only with respect to quasi-legal and also secret groups such as the CIA and other operations, but you can see this involves the connections of people who are more or less in a position where they can use people for certain ends. Now, for example, Clay Shaw, we'll say, is in a position as director of the International Trade Mart to oversee operations of the second largest seaport in this country. Now, even Gordon Novell, who is one of the witnesses that Garrison is seeking to extradite from another state, and in fact has had very little success, which Bill has mentioned that there have been obstructions. One of the things he's had difficulty in is in getting people extradited from different states. There are 3 states now that have refused to extradite material witnesses in this case. Anyway, Gordon Novell, who is a very interesting character in this whole case, who also has admitted publicly that he has CIA connections, is reported to have said that Clay Shaw himself probably was connected with the CIA. So what I'm trying to make here is that you can understand why then the Shaw trial would be blocked from coming into court, because the connections that are involved here go very deep within the government, as I see it. And that's this is my belief why that trial is being obstructed, not only insofar as Shaw's involvement in the assassination. I think it has a lot to do with connections that the government has set up.
Now, I would think that Mr. Garrison's life was not worth much on the open market if he proceeds with this. Does he travel with a bodyguard? Does he feel secure? And what motivates this man? Now, you've met him, you've talked to him. What's he in this for? You hear the crack, well, it's a lot of cheap publicity, he can't prove anything, but it's put him on the front pages of all papers and all this kind of thing. I would suspect that it was also liable to put him in his coffin.
Well, I believe that this could be the case, Elsa. When I first went down to New Orleans after his case broke, I really had some reservations about what a Southern prosecutor prosecuting attorney was going to be like, and what his motives might be.
It did seem a little unlikely, the whole thing, when it first began to break.
It did seem a little unlikely. I have now come to the conclusion that Jim Garrison is an unusual man in an unusual place at an unusual time. Now, the allegations have been bandied around that he got into this thing for political ends, and I can only say that if this was his motivation, that he is extremely ignorant of how politicians get elected.
So I should think it would indicate rather bad judgment.
Extremely bad judgment. Now, as I say, I was prepared to meet a Southern prosecuting attorney. I had a stereotype in my mind, which is always bad, but I did. And I ran into a man who was unusual in any region of the country. Garrison was at Dachau, and I think this made an indelible impression on him. Now, before he's also extremely
What do you
well
mean he was at Dachau?
with the Allied armies when they came upon Dachau.
When they went into
I'm
Dachau.
sorry, I should have elucidated a bit on that. And I think that the residual sight there just indelibly impressed him, because when he wrote an introduction to a very well accepted criminology book before this whole investigation came up. Now, understand that the very fact that he was asked to write this introduction is somewhat an honor, that before this he was well known in criminology circles. It is a very sensitive and historically based introduction. And he goes back to Dachau and the apathy of the German people that permitted this to happen, and he draws a parallel with the Kitty Genovese case in New York, where 36 people watched in their windows as this girl was slowly killed. And he talks about this lack of commitment and lack of involvement. And maybe I can just read the tail end of this allegory that he brings up at the end of his introduction, and he's talking about some extraterrestrial being who happens upon our self-destroyed Earth at some future date, and happens upon this human skull, and here's what Garrison writes in this allegory. He puts the words in the mouth of this being. Alas, poor man, a fellow of most infinite jest, of most excellent fancy, where are your gibbets now, your thumbscrews and your gallows, your treasured hates and your cruelties? What happened to your disinterested millions, your uncommitted and uninvolved, your preoccupied and bored? Where today are their private horizons and their mirrored worlds of self? Where is their splendid indifference now? Now, this is Garrison, really, when you talk to the man. We were both in the FBI, and he asks me about a particular weapon that's in a photograph. And I said, I don't know what it is, Jim. Matter of fact, I don't like guns. And he says, isn't that funny? He said, I don't either. So he's a rather unusual prosecutor, and he's an extremely sensitive man. He told me, a year ago, before this whole thing started, he said, I was vis-a-vis Vietnam. I was what you might call a mild hawk. He said, I'm really a dove now. He said, this whole thing has changed my thinking. Now, if this is a fool or a knave or a political opportunist, so be it, but I just don't believe it. And I think that the press has portrayed him in this light, and they have portrayed him in this light in a very calculated manner. And I think that we have a very definite problem here in New Orleans. As Garrison puts it, I am probably the only prosecutor, not defendant, that has been convicted in the press prior to the trial. And if they can silence Garrison, and when I say they, I mean the orchestrated attack obviously from Washington, obviously involving the mass media, if they can silence Garrison, I'm afraid they'll be able to silence anyone. If they can portray him in an unfair light, I think they can do it to anyone. And I think that there's, over and above, or maybe parallel to the issue of who killed Kennedy, there is this issue of the press in the United States. And it's completely slanted coverage of what is going on down there.
Is there anything else you would like to say about what you envisage as the future progress of this before we close the interview?
Well,
either of you, or both of you.
Well, I think that as I say, every day there seems to be a new development in Garrison's case, not that it makes the papers, but internally. I have seen his evidence, practically all of it, at any rate, because having researched the Minutemen a year and a half ago, and the Minutemen being involved in this thing, I would suppose that much of the information I have is valuable to his investigation. I would say that he has a very excellent case. It gets better every day, and if, as we both stated, that if we were back in the FBI and we could had 6,000 agents around the country, and we could get on that teletype and mark it urgent and send out these leads that this assassination conspiracy would be solved inside of 3 weeks and the conspirators would be in jail. But as I've outlined to you, Garrison has very limited jurisdiction, only within the parish of Orleans. He has encountered all kinds of obstructionist tactics from the FBI, from the national press, from the governors of the various states, from people within his own bailiwick, even from an infiltrator in his own organization, which CBS gave national coverage to, and CBS has yet to report that Dean Andrews has been convicted of perjury. So
Dean Andrews, I take it, was the man you refer to as having infiltrated the Garrison.
William Gurvich is the one who infiltrated down there, and then went on and made some very anti-Garrison statements, and saying that the man didn't have a case. And this CBS interrupted its 4-part series to put Gurvich on. But they didn't interrupt their series the next night to report that Gurvich had been allowed to testify as to what factual material he had before the grand jury in New Orleans, and the grand jury decided that he didn't have any facts. They didn't interrupt their program for that.
Well, what about the man who was convicted of perjury? Because I don't know who he is.
Dean Andrews is the attorney in New Orleans who I originally told you that Clay Shaw is alleged to be Clay Bertram. Dean Andrews is the attorney whom Bertram referred Oswald to him.
I see.
And he's the one that got the phone call the day after the assassination from Clay Bertram to defend Oswald. And
did he perjure himself about this?
Yes, it was about this. He was very, with no qualifications at all, he told the Warren Commission that he could positively identify this Clay Bertram, and if he ever got his hands on him, he'd drag him right in. So he's hauled before some kind of a hearing down there to see whether he can identify Clay Shaw or not as Clay Bertram. And he says, I wouldn't be able to identify anyone as whether it was Clay Bertram or not. He completely changed his story. And when Mark Lane tried to interview him, this was 2 years ago, first he said, yes, fine, come on up. And by the time Mark Lane got to his office, he said, gosh, I'm sorry, I can't discuss anything about it. I've called Washington, and they have, in effect, told me that if I say anything, I'll get a hole in my head. So he said, I'll take you to dinner, though. So this is a kind of thing that constantly comes up, this intimidation of witnesses, this trying to either bribe them or lure them to tell a different story.
Yes, Hal.
Yes, Bill mentioned Bill Gurvich. I want to show the very subtle ways in which the press can distort the picture. CBS had presented Bill Gurvich, and in fact the press throughout the country had presented Bill Gurvich as Garrison's chief investigator. Now the fact is that Gurvich was never the chief investigator. As a matter of fact, if I'm not correct, Bill, isn't the assistant ranking district attorney the chief investigator?
Hal, Garrison's office doesn't really have a pecking order there, but Charles Ward is the assistant district, senior district But they have a detective posted from the New Orleans Police Department who really is the chief investigator.
Louis
His name
Ivan.
is Louis
Right.
Ivan.
That's correct.
And he succeeded a man by the name of Pershing Gervais when Gervais resigned a year or two ago.
Right. Now, CBS, in presenting this, didn't present, Gervich's real relationship to this Garrison investigation. He wasn't on a payroll. He had volunteered his information or his services, and this, of course, did not come out in CBS interview. Another curious and interesting thing about this is the timing of Gervich's resignation, or declining to associate himself any further with this investigation. When did this occur? This occurred at the end of June of this year, 1967, when at the very time the Associated Press and CBS and NBC were all coming out with their programs. I don't think that this timing is just accidental. I think, in my own view, I think this was a deliberate timing to sort of create the impression that Garrison was a totally discredited figure, and that he was that his investigation had no validity to it.
But I gather from all the detailed information and statements that you have given, and also the overall complexion of what you both had to say, that you feel that Garrison has a case, and that this is a man of high ideals and integrity who is attempting to do something that he believes in. Would that be?
I definitely feel that Garrison is a very committed man, and that he feels that this is very definitely a conspiracy here, and that come hell or high water, it's his duty to investigate that conspiracy, to bring to justice those who are involved in it, at least as far as his own jurisdiction in Orleans Parish is concerned. And it would have been far more in his own interests, as far as political aspirations, any future aspirations, to have merely said when Ferry died, well, there goes my chief witness, that's the case, and forget it. He would have had a much better chance of becoming Louisiana senator or whatever these aspirations are supposed to be. And I certainly hope he does have political ambitions, because I'd like to see a man of his caliber in high office.
Well, as I understand it, he says that he's going to go on with this if it takes him the next 30 years. But I believe that now our time is up, and I want to thank you very much, William Turner and Hal Verb, for coming in to our studios.